Long before he became Pope Benedict XVI, the theologian Joseph Ratzinger had this incredibly powerful and, pretty controversial vision for the soul of Europe. He was convinced the continent was going through a massive identity crisis. And this wasn't about politics or economics, it was about its very spirit. So let's get into his compelling argument. This line from the Roman poet Ovid is really the key to understanding everything Ratzinger was trying to say. He took this ancient myth of Europa, this maiden who gets abducted and carried out to sea, and used it as this powerful metaphor for modern Europe. He saw a continent that was just adrift, looking back with real sadness at the cultural shores it had left behind. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the myth itself. Then, we'll dive into what Ratzinger actually meant by the whole concept of Europe. After that, we'll get into the kidnappers he said were threatening it, both way back in history and in our modern world. And finally, we'll look at his, let's say, provocative idea for a rescue mission. So, let's kick things off with Act 1, the myth of Europa. And we really need to get this story because for Ratzinger, this was way more than just some ancient tale. It was a living, breathing metaphor for the continent's entire spiritual journey. So the story goes a little something like this. You've got Europa, this beautiful, kind of naive young woman just hanging out on the beach. The god Zeus sees her, wants her, and so he transforms himself into the stunning white bull. She's totally charmed, has no idea what's up, and she climbs onto its back. And in a flash, that gentle bull goes wild, charges straight into the ocean, and carries her away from everything she's ever known. That image right there, being torn away from a familiar shore, that's the one to keep in your head.
Okay, so now let's see how this myth becomes the foundation for Ratzinger's whole argument. Because, to understand the abduction, we have to first understand the victim. What or who is Europa in this big metaphor? And this is the absolute core question Ratzinger was asking. Is it just a bunch of countries on a map, a political alliance like the EU, an economic zone? He argued no. It's something much, much deeper than that. And here's his answer. For Ratzinger, Europe is, first and foremost, an idea. It's a shared story, a really unique blend of cultural and historical forces that created this very specific way of thinking about humanity, about reason, and about faith. You can't just draw a line on a map and say, yep, this is where Europe stops. It's bigger than that. He argued that this European idea stands on three main pillars. First, you've got the Greco-Latin heritage. That's what gave us philosophy, law, and this commitment to rational thought. Second, you've got modernity, which gave us the Enlightenment with its values of human rights and freedom of conscience. And third, holding it all together, is what he called the Christian synthesis. Now, this idea of a synthesis is absolutely crucial. Ratzinger saw Christianity as the force that managed to fuse the reason of Athens with the faith of Jerusalem. For him, this marriage of ideas was the bedrock of Europe. In fact, he called any attempt to pull them apart a foolish and hopeless attempt. He did not mince words. Okay, so that brings us to Act 2 of his argument. If Europe is this unique cultural thing, then who are the kidnappers trying to drag it away from its own foundations? Ratzinger pointed to a few, starting with what he saw as a major historical opponent. Now, in a 1979 text, a younger Ratzinger made this pretty stark assessment. It's really important to note the date and the context here. From his perspective, he saw a fundamental challenge coming from a different worldview that, in his analysis, had historically defined itself in opposition to that European synthesis we just talked about. The key point of his critique really centered on the separation of powers. He argued that, for the most part, historically, Islam fuses religious and civil law into one. And that, he said, stands in direct contrast to the European model, which, over centuries, developed this relative separation between the church and the state. But Ratzinger wasn't just looking at external threats. He argued that new, and maybe even more dangerous kidnappers had popped up from within Europe itself, ideas that were actually born from its own history. The call was coming from inside the house. I mean, what a description. This points to his second kidnapper, the Enlightenment. Now, he wasn't against reason or freedom or rights, not at all, but he was deeply, deeply worried about what happens when you cut those amazing ideas off from their ethical roots. And this chart just lays out his point perfectly.
The promise of reason and freedom, when it's just floating free, becomes what he called a confused ideology of freedom. He argued it eventually turns on itself. It uses scientific determinism to say we have no real freedom, and it creates this new secular dogmatism that can be just as hostile to liberty as any ancient religious authority. And then we have a third kidnapper. This one is the modern ideologue, the utopian revolutionary. This character, who you can imagine personifying ideologies like Marxism, promises to build a perfect new world, but only by completely tearing down the old one. So in this kind of worldview, the highest good, the summum bonum, it's not truth, it's not justice, it's world revolution. Morality becomes completely relative. Basically, anything that helps bring about this new world is suddenly moral, even if it means destroying the very values of life and dignity that built Europe in the first place. So, if Europe has been abducted by these powerful forces, how does it get back to shore? Is there a way back? Well, this brings us to Act 3, Ratzinger's proposal for a rescue. Now, his solution wasn't to just turn back the clock. It was actually to save the great achievements of modernity, like human rights and freedom, by re-anchoring them. He's saying that reason and freedom need an ethical foundation to survive. That law has to be based on some kind of truth that can't just be twisted by whoever's in power, and that the sacredness of every single human life has to be an absolute, no exception. This chart really gets to the heart of his political idea. See, the state does not create ethics. Ethics are supreme. A just state has to recognize that there are moral convictions that stand above it. The state then derives its legitimate laws from this higher ethical framework, instead of just making them up based on power or the will of the majority. For Ratzinger, this was the ultimate test case. The right to life, especially for the weakest, the most vulnerable, it couldn't be a matter of opinion or convenience. He warned that if you start making exceptions, if you start saying some lives are worth less than others, then the whole concept of universal human rights just collapses. It becomes a system where the strong get to decide who even qualifies for rights. And this led him to pose this really provocative question to challenge the idea of a purely neutral state. He argued that by systematically removing every reference to God or a transcendent moral order, the state isn't actually becoming neutral. It's actively promoting a new, godless worldview, which can lead to that terrifying conclusion that Dostoevsky warned about. If God does not exist, everything is permitted. And this all brings us to his final and maybe his most striking proposal. He didn't demand that agnostics and secularists suddenly convert. Instead, he made this very pragmatic philosophical plea. He asked them to try living veludi deus derator, as if God existed. To act as if there is a transcendent truth, as if there is a moral law woven into the universe. And why? Because in his view, it is the only practical way to save the very values of reason, freedom, and human dignity that define the soul of Europe, and to give that abducted maiden the strength to finally swim back to shore.